सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In India, every year is an exciting one because some state or the other is going for elections. And this time around as well, in the remaining part of the year, we have 5 states that are going for elections. There's Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, and Mizoram. And so in this episode, we're going to look at the finances of the bigger 4 states and see where they stand as they go towards elections. So this episode is actually going to be slightly different from our previous ones. It's going to be more like a state-wise report card. And so I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP, who's actually looked at the state finances and can actually give us a lot of insight into how the states are doing. So Radhika, I'm going to start with Rajasthan. There are a number of metrics that you've looked at. So within Rajasthan, let's look at first the capital expenditure that the state is doing or not doing.
Yeah. So Rajasthan is one state where the share of capital expenditure as a share of total expenditure is quite low as compared to the other states that are poll bound. So what is important is to look at a couple of metrics relating to capital expenditure. One is the share of capital expenditure in the overall expenditure of the state, and the other is that how much the state has budgeted, whether the state has been able to achieve that target or not.
Right.
So those are the 2 metrics we look at to understand the priority of the state given to capital expenditure. And there we see that Rajasthan, the share of capital expenditure in the overall expenditure is just 8%.
Oh.
Which is quite low. That means in other words that 92% of the overall expenditure is revenue expenditure in Rajasthan. That is point number 1. The second observation is that they have been able to achieve just 50% of the budgeted target for capital expenditure. So those 2 metrics tell us about the priority to capex, because we have a very important data source which comes from the CAG, which provides us about the provisional actuals. And now, because the year has ended, the financial year 2022-23 has ended, we can actually see the performance of the state, that whatever budgeted, whatever promises were made in terms of revenues or in terms of expenditures, in terms of the different schemes, whether they have been fulfilled or not. And from that data set only, we see that Rajasthan has been able to achieve just 50% of its target on capital expenditure. That also leads to the second problem, which is that its revenue deficit is very high, because most of the time it's the revenue expenditure is very high. It's as I said, only 8% is capital expenditure, so the balance is revenue expenditure.
Right.
So if the revenue expenditure is very high and it exceeds the revenue receipts, you are going to get a revenue deficit.
Right, of course. And so now, speaking of deficits, we of course come to the fiscal deficit.
Correct. Yeah.
And so how is Rajasthan doing there?
So there also, see, we have a fiscal consolidation roadmap which is given by the Finance Commission for its award period, the 5-year award period. And there the target was for 2021-22, the states had to achieve 4% fiscal deficit, then for the next year 3.5%, and from this financial year onwards, that is 23-24, the target is 3%.
Right.
And central government has given a leeway of another 0.5% of gross state domestic product if the states are doing power sector reforms.
Right.
So now on these metrics, so ideally the fiscal deficit should be closer to 3.5% and better closer to 3%. But in case of Rajasthan, we see that the deficits are higher.
Right.
They are closer to 4%. And interestingly, an important thing to note here is that in the RBI's analysis, RBI had done an analysis of state finances recently, a risk-based analysis. There also Rajasthan features as one of the highly stressful states.
Right.
So they had identified a list of 10 states which were problematic on some of the indicators, and then there were a core group of states which were problematic on most of the indicators, namely fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, debt, interest payments to revenue receipts. So on most of the indicators, Rajasthan has not been performing well. So that is the issue here.
Right. So we've spoken about capital expenditure and of course then revenue expenditure and fiscal deficit. Let's come to the liabilities of the state and whether it is very, very highly debt laden.
Yes, so because what's happening is that the state, Rajasthan, has been having consistently a revenue deficit and also fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is your total expenditure minus revenue receipts and non-debt creating capital receipts.
Right.
That means if an ideal situation would be that state has a revenue surplus, in that case, whatever borrowings are being done, that is for capital expenditure. But in a state like Rajasthan, we have a revenue deficit as well as fiscal deficit, which means that borrowings are being done to not only finance capital expenditure, but also your day-to-day expenditures, your recurring expenditure, which falls within the category of revenue expenditure.
Right.
So that is the point here. And before we just move to outstanding liabilities, one very interesting feature of Rajasthan, which will also tell us about whether Rajasthan has the space, fiscal space as it goes into election. Does it have the space, additional scope for incurring additional expenditures or not? We look at a very important metric, which is committed expenditure as a proportion of the total revenue receipts. Now, what is committed expenditure? The expenditure that the state has to do, which typically includes the pensions, salaries, and the interest payments. So if these three expenditure components make up for a sizable chunk of the revenues of the states, that leaves very little scope for further expenditure, be it on productive expenditure, be it on development expenditure, be it on capex. So that is what we are seeing. In case of Rajasthan, almost 58 to 59% of the revenue receipts are being spent on just these three items.
I see.
Which is the pensions, the salaries, and the interest payment. And add to that, if we add subsidies, it will the budget will swell even further. So that is the problem. And because our committed expenditure is high and it's around 58% of revenue receipts, it then swells into the outstanding liabilities. It's borrowings because committed expenditures are very high. You are having a fiscal deficit. You are having a revenue deficit. So how will it be financed? It will be financed through borrowing. And those borrowings will be done every year because we are talking about outstanding liabilities.
And then the interest payments on this will, of course, be part of the committed expenditure. So that proportion will also
go up. So those are the two very important metrics to assess the sustainability of the finances of any state government, or to assess the sustainability of the debt position, whether the state is extremely vulnerable or whether the state is in a position to undertake additional expenditures or to commit to make promises for the freebies or something, such kind of expenditure. So for that, it's very important to look at what is the share of committed expenditure that has already been taken care of by revenue receipts. And if it is very large, that means you hardly have enough revenues to make further promises. And then if you want to do such expenditures, or if you want to make additional promises in the nature of freebies, they have to be at the cost of higher borrowings. So that is what in Rajasthan we have been seeing. If we look at the trajectory of outstanding liabilities, it is a very steep increase. It is understandable that after COVID the outstanding liabilities would have increased. But in case of Rajasthan, it has been the outstanding liabilities have been increasing from 2014-15.
I see.
And one of the important reason for this is the discoms. A lot of loans have been taken by the state government to address the woes of the discoms through the issue of Uday bond. So if you look at the composition of the total borrowings, the composition of liabilities, a considerable chunk is going for discoms. Almost 50 to 55,000 crore is towards Rajasthan for the Uday bonds.
Right. And so now relating to Rajasthan, we had one question from the audience, which is talking about the future liabilities provisions due to Rajasthan adopting the old pension scheme. And also, as you mentioned about the RBI and what it said in last year's report about the state finances and especially Rajasthan not being in a good shape.
Yeah. So again, let's look at the share of pensions as a share of total revenue expenditure.
Right.
Already the share of pension in the total revenue expenditure is around 10 to 11% in Rajasthan.
Wow. Okay.
So and now if the government has decided to revert to the old pension system, it may not be felt, the fiscal impact may not be felt currently, but what will happen in that from 2034 onwards, when the employees who are enrolled under the NPS, they start to retire, we will see that the shift towards OPS will be felt at that time.
Right.
So that is the point. One needs to, there is a trade-off between future fiscal finances and the present fiscal finances, intergenerational equity, and how much a state has the capacity to borrow, how much the state has the capacity to repay. Because with all these commitments, the debt burden is going to rise. So whether the state has the capacity to repay, whether the state has enough revenues to repay the interest burden, or will the interest burden also keep accumulating as a proportion of revenue receipts? These are some of the important policy questions that any state has to encounter.
Right.
So to make any decision, one has to look at these indicators. It's not that it's not possible for a state to make electoral promises or to revert back to OPS, but then one has to look carefully at its finances. One has to look at its debt position, its revenue receipts, its buoyancy, and do some kind of a debt sustainability analysis to see whether it is in a position to undertake these policy decisions.
Absolutely. And so now we come to our next state number 2, which would be Madhya Pradesh. Again, with Madhya Pradesh, let's start with capital expenditure. How are they doing?
Yeah. So in contrast to Rajasthan, we see that Madhya Pradesh, again, we look at the two metrics that we looked at, which is the share of capital expenditure in the overall expenditure of Madhya Pradesh. And there we see that Madhya Pradesh share is 18%. Compare and contrast with Rajasthan, which is 8%. Here it is 18%. And also if we look at how much they have been able to achieve last year, they have been able to achieve 97% of their budgeted. Yes, so they budgeted around 45,000 crore as capital outlay, and they were able to achieve more than 43,000 crore. Not only that, if we look into their budget statements, now the problem is that they come in Hindi, so it is it's a task to look at these, especially the technical terms. But if one, tries to understand, it's very interesting to go through their medium-term fiscal policy strategy statements and the 3 statements that come along with the FRBM.
Right.
And there also very categorically they have stated that they would like to place more emphasis on capital expenditure. So that is going to be their priority. They are going to borrow from the central government also around 10,000 crore in this financial year.
This is part of that interest-free 50-year interest-free loan.
Yes. Right. This is part of the interest-free loan, which does add up to their fiscal deficit. Yes. So that is there. But they have specified, because in the case of Madhya Pradesh also, if we talk about the second metric, which is fiscal deficit, there also their fiscal deficit for the current financial year, that is 23-24, they have estimated it higher than the 3.5%, which is required. Right. But they have given this justification that this is higher because they are going to borrow money for the purposes of capital expenditure.
Okay.
So that is a positive feature, and flowing from that, another positive feature is that they have been having a consistent revenue surplus. which is a very healthy development from 2004 onwards. So from 2004 onwards, Madhya Pradesh has had a revenue surplus. Only 2 years during the COVID time, they had a deficit. And again, this in the previous just concluded financial year, they had a revenue surplus. That means whatever fiscal deficit or borrowing they're going to do, that is mainly for incurring capital expenditure,
Right.
because their revenue receipts are adequate to cover their revenue expenditure. In fact, revenue receipts are
Right.
more and they have a revenue surplus.
And so now committed expenditure obviously also comes under revenue expenditure.
Yes.
So which means that all of their salaries, pensions, interest payments, all of that is taken care of.
Yeah, it's again, as we talk in terms of their share in revenue receipts, it's lower than what we saw in case of Rajasthan. So that is again a positive feature for Madhya Pradesh.
Fantastic. So then that would suggest that their liabilities should be lower.
Their liabilities are comparatively lower. What has happened is, again, if we look at their trajectory of outstanding liabilities, they were moving at a gradual pace. Only during the COVID time, there was a steep surge in outstanding liabilities, and since then, there has that increase in the pace has been maintained. But again, as I said, they have come up with the rolling targets for both fiscal deficit as well as their outstanding liabilities, that how much they are going to reduce over the coming 2 to 3 years. And there we see that their at least their commitment is to reduce the outstanding liabilities in the coming years, which is also reflected in their interest payments to revenue receipts. Now here it's a very important indicator to look at interest payments to revenue receipts, because it shows how much your revenue receipts are going towards repayment of the existing debt. And if so, 14th Finance Commission gave a ballpark number. It said that if this ratio is 10%, it is tolerable. If it becomes more than 10%, that means interest payments constitute more than 10% of revenue receipts. It is a problem. It then casts spell on the sustainability position of the debt. And there also we see that for Madhya Pradesh, it is around 9 to 10%. So it is tolerable. So it's all, all these indicators that we are looking at, they are all interconnected in one way or the other.
Yeah,
because if a state has a higher capex and it has a revenue surplus, fiscal deficit is bound to be lower, liabilities are bound to be lower, interest payments as a share of receipts are bound to be lower, and then the state does have scope for incurring additional expenditures or making promises. So those kind of metrics need to be analyzed in addition to doing a debt sustainability analysis.
Right. So just to sum up, for Madhya Pradesh, their capex is relatively high.
Yes.
Their fiscal deficit is higher than target, but not very, very high.
Yes.
They have committed to borrow more from the center to put into capex.
Yes.
Their revenue position seems to be pretty strong. They're in a revenue surplus, which means all of their committed expenditure is easily being paid for from their own revenues.
Correct.
So it's a reasonably strong position that they are in going into the elections.
Yeah. So I think out of all the 4 states, in terms of looking at these 4 metrics, we see that Madhya Pradesh is comparatively better than the other states. Leaving aside the outstanding liabilities, which have risen for all the states during the last 2-3 years, but other than that, in terms of capex and in terms of their priority to spend on capex, even not only in the year that has passed by. In fact, for the next financial year, the current financial year also, they have said that they are going to spend 20% of their expenditure on capex. So, which was 18%, they're going to raise it further to 20%. So all these kind of statements are quite encouraging from the Madhya Pradesh's budget.
Right. And as we've talked before, expenditure on capital, it has a multiplier effect on the economy. Some can argue that even revenue expenditure has some benefits, but capital expenditure has a multiplier effect. And so in terms of the carry-on effects to other industries, to people, in terms of generating employment, capital expenditure is considered better.
Yeah, and just to add, it is also non-inflationary as compared to revenue expenditures, because here you are creating assets, you are creating employment, and then you are putting money in the hands of people, but at the same time productivity is also increasing.
Right.
So it is if the tendency or the target is to contain inflation, the way to go about is to have a capex oriented growth.
Right. Okay. So, and now coming to state number 3, Chhattisgarh.
Yeah.
And again, we start with capital expenditure as a proportion of the total and revenue expenditure on the other side.
So, for Chhattisgarh, out of the 4 states that we are discussing, Chhattisgarh has the lowest allocation to capital expenditure. So this is just a comparison of the 4 states that we are looking at. Chhattisgarh has the lowest allocation among these 4 states. But whatever they have allocated, they have been able to achieve around 76% of their target. Which is not bad. And again, as proportion of their total expenditure, their capex is around 14%, which is also good. The most positive feature about Chhattisgarh is that they have been strictly maintaining fiscal prudence in terms of fiscal deficit.
That's refreshing.
Yes, so that is not 3.5, but it is 3. For them, it is 3.
Wow.
In fact, it is 2.99 if you look at their rolling deficit targets, which comes along with their budget statement. So they are very clear on maintaining a fiscal deficit of 3%, which is a very welcome development for Chhattisgarh. And also they were able to attain, like Madhya Pradesh, they were able to attain a surplus on their revenue account, which is again a very encouraging development for Chhattisgarh.
Okay, so then we've spoken about their capex, the revenue expenditure, the fiscal deficit. We come to the committed expenditure, how much they're spending on salaries and interest. And
so that is also within range. So it's like intermediate, it's around 30 to 35% of the overall expenditures and revenue receipts that they are spending. So it doesn't seem to be much of a problem even on that front. And because their fiscal deficits have been lower and they are on a surplus on their revenue account, their outstanding liabilities out of the 4 states is the least, and it's growing also at a very gradual pace. And we have taken also from 2014-15, the year when the state was formed. Telangana was formed in 2014-15. So we are comparing the trajectory of these 4 states from 2014-15 onward in absolute terms, and we are seeing that Rajasthan has the most steepest rise, and then Madhya Pradesh, it was growing gradually. It rose. There was a steep surge only during the
this
COVID
is in
liabilities, outstanding liabilities. And Chhattisgarh is growing at a very gradual pace as compared to liabilities are concerned, not only in absolute level terms like in rupees lakh crore, but also as a percentage of GSDP. So I think Chhattisgarh is at least on if we look at their budget statements and if we look at the CAG figures, they look quite good on their fiscal position.
Right, and so that actually is quite heartening to see, but they are lagging behind on capital expenditure.
Yeah, they are lagging behind on capital expenditure in terms of the absolute amount. So if we compare a state like Madhya Pradesh, they are spending more than 40,000 crore on capital expenditure, and this time they have budgeted around 50,000 crore. But for Chhattisgarh, it is around 16 to 17,000 crore, less than 20,000 crore.
But it is a smaller state. So
it is a smaller state.
But as a percentage of their total expenditure,
it is 14%, which is good, which is higher than the other 2 states. One we've already spoken, Rajasthan, but also it is higher than Telangana.
Right. Do you see now this might be bringing a slight political twist to our discussion, but do you see that the Congress states have different priorities as opposed to the BJP states? Because the central government is pushing very hard for capital expenditure,
right,
and that has trickled down into a lot of the BJP ruled states.
Yes,
but we see that the Congress run states might have different priorities. Is this also coming out?
It's for Madhya Pradesh. It's quite clear, and it's as you rightly pointed out, BJP ruled state, and their capital expenditure is the priority, reflected in the numbers as well as in the statement. But it's also the case for Chhattisgarh. Also, we are seeing, but not for Rajasthan. So, in case of Rajasthan, it's not very clear if they are prioritizing. At least the numbers do not indicate, because they were able to attain just 50% of their target for capital expenditure. So they seem to be more inclined towards the committed expenditure, and that is what is reflected in the committed expenditure as a share of revenue receipts, almost touching 60%, which is a problem which has been highlighted by the RBI, which has been highlighted by the Finance Commission also, which has been highlighted by the CAG also. CAG comes up with the state finance audit report, and it's not only the liabilities, but also they've also talked about the off-budget liabilities of Rajasthan, which are quite high, and now central government is trying to put a cap on it and trying to put a check on it. But if we look at over the last 2-3 years, the liability position is a cause of concern for Rajasthan, and also in terms of capex allocation also seems to be a cause of concern.
Right. And so why I actually asked this is because I foresee that once this video is published, the comment section is going to bring politics into it. And it's, I think, important to point out that it really doesn't have that much to do with the political party in power. It's to do with that particular state government. And
also local issues. If you look at, it's very important to look at their budget documents. All of them, all these states have some priorities. They have different schemes, depending on some state, maybe they have some Naxal hit region. So they have to budget something for those kind of regions also. So it's not just political, it's more to do with the local conditions and the schemes, the kind of scheme that Madhya Pradesh, a lot of schemes have been run for the girl child in Madhya Pradesh, even in Chhattisgarh, and for farmers, a lot of schemes have been initiated. So it's more to do with the local climate and the local priorities than to just being that the central government is pushing and therefore Madhya Pradesh is doing. It may not be the case, because we don't see that in that factor solely being the responsible,
the driving force.
Yes.
Right. And so on that note, let's get to state number 4, which is Telangana. How are they doing on capital expenditure and the other expenditures?
So again, for Telangana is a problem in the sense that their share in the total expenditure and share as how much they have been able to attain, it's in between. It's not doing as bad as Rajasthan, but I think there is a scope for improvement in enhancing capex allocation. So their share is 10%.
Okay.
That means capital expenditure accounts for 10% of the overall total expenditure, which means
of the 4 states, it's the third worst. Then
it's the third worst. Yes, yes. On this metric, it is the third worst. And then on capex, we are talking about. So 10% of the overall expenditure is accounted for by capital expenditure, which means that 90% is revenue expenditure, and also in terms of how much they have been able to attain in 22-23, it's 60%. So again,
which is again
Rajasthan 50%.
So third worst again.
Telangana 60%, and in Chhattisgarh 76%, and Madhya Pradesh 97%.
Which is
that
great.
Is the we look at how much they have been able to spend on the basis of what they allocated, what they allocated in the budget, and the provisional estimates from the CAG tell us how much they have been able to spend by the end of the financial year. So that is the position on capex. The problem with Telangana is that their committed expenditures have been rising again, if we look at from what they budgeted for, we'll look at the last year, what they budgeted and what they have finally spent. There is a big gap between that. So that is a problem. So as according to the budget, they had to spend 33% of their revenue receipts on committed expenditure.
Okay.
But what they finally ended up doing is more than 40%. So it's around 42-43%.
And this is because of a jump in salary?
Interest payments. It is
Interest
due
payments,
to
I
jump
see.
in interest payments. All the three components have seen a jump, which
Okay.
is in contrast to the other three states where they have shown a decline from
Right.
BE, from budget estimates to provisional estimates. There is a decline in absolute terms.
Right.
But for Telangana, the key finding emerging is that what they budgeted and what they ended up doing by the end of the financial year in terms of these three items of committed expenditure, interest payments, pensions and salaries, it's much higher than what they budgeted. But again, as a percentage of revenue receipts, Rajasthan fares the worst.
Okay, so now that tells us that Telangana is not in a terrible position,
Yeah.
but there is scope
I need
for
to
improvement.
watch at least their committed expenditures. If they are rising at a brisk pace,
Right.
if they are rising at they were not able to anticipate the increase in all the three components of committed expenditure. That is something to be watched out for,
Right.
because if they continue to rise at this pace, then it will show up as a higher proportion of the revenue receipts, and that will create problem for the scope for additional expenditures would be squeezed.
Right, and so that means are they borrowing more then?
Yes, they are borrowing more. Again, in terms of if you look at their trajectory, they have also seen a steep rise. Particularly, they have seen an increase from 2016-17. So that is what we are seeing in terms of their liability position, and also in terms of the interest payments. They are again in between. They are not as bad as Rajasthan, but there is a slight problem, but still they are tolerable in terms of interest payments to revenue receipts.
Okay.
So that is the position.
All right. So now we come to a few more audience questions. One of them is that, do you think that the state government's priorities on spending on freebies and basically on revenue expenditure and not on capex, is this the reason why private sector investment is not picking up in these states as much as the state governments would like?
So I think private investment is governed by multiple factors, as we've discussed in previous episodes also. It's more to do with the cost of capital. It's more to do with the demand situation. It's more to do with the investment climate. Obviously, if there is emphasis on capex, that will lead to crowding in of private sector
Right.
investment. But just that much won't be sufficient. We need to tick all the boxes. We need to see that the private investment, the capacity utilization is already attained 75%. Then only there is scope for incurring fresh investments. So that is important. Investment is also driven by, there's a very nice paper by RBI which says that investment depends on low and stable inflation. So if
Right.
there is low and stable inflation, that will promote investments in addition to just the state government's push to capex. So in addition to state government's push to capex, there are multiple factors: demand situation, uncertainty, low and stable inflation, capacity utilization. And when all these factors turn favorable, then we see a sustained mood for private investments.
I see. And now another question, and this is an interesting point that they raise, which is that except for Telangana, the rest of the states that we've discussed are consuming states.
Right.
And so in these kind of states, freebies tend to work, that they're received much better. But the person asks, is this a sustainable way for a state government to go
Yeah.
forward?
That is the problem, whether it is sustainable or not, that is the key question. And that is why we are saying that, the state needs to look at its finances, whether it has the fiscal space to spend on freebies. And when we say fiscal space, we need to see that how much is its committed expenditure as a proportion of revenue receipts, where is it liabilities going, where is it interest payment going. If these variables are already at a very high level, it's very hard to bring an outstanding debt which is around 38 to 40% to 35%.
Right.
It takes years.
Yeah.
So, and therefore, if you look at the central government debt to GDP ratio, it's going to be around 83% for 3-4 years. So it takes time. So when you have these kind of a situation, it's important to look at the sustainability of debt and to see whether the state has space for additional freebies.
Right. And speaking of additional fiscal space, the final question we have is, how do you compel the states and even the center to keep to the FRBM targets that they have set for themselves?
That is extremely important. And first thing is the FRBM, particularly for the central government, it needs to be amended to reflect the modified targets.
Right.
So it has not been amended. So first and foremost thing is that the FRBM needs to be amended to reflect the modified targets, and which is also the case for state governments, where we have, if they are going by the trajectory of the finance commissions in terms of the liabilities and in terms of the fiscal deficit, then they need to make sure that the FRBM legislation is amended to incorporate the new trajectory, the new glide paths of fiscal consolidation. Now, coming to the how you do to some extent, that is already happening in a related way, especially for state governments, because we know that the central government has put a check on the states' off-budget liabilities.
Right.
Central government has put a check on its own extra budgetary resources, that we know all the off-budget liabilities were brought on budget. The borrowing through National Small Savings Funds and all those off-budget items were brought on budget. And the same thing the central government is asking the states also to do, because some of the states are having a very high magnitude of off-budget liability.
Like Rajasthan. Which then masks the actual position on fiscal deficit. So on paper, they may be adhering to the FRBM targets, but that may not be true if we include the off-budget liabilities also into the fiscal deficit target. So now all that thing is being, that work has already started, which is a very welcome development, that all the states are trying to bring their off-budget liabilities on budget. And that is a very, that's a first step towards making, considering FRBM as a serious legislation and adhering to it. Right. So now on that note, this is what we have. We've brought to you this report card of the 4 major states that are going for elections. Hopefully this will inform all of you and all of the voters who are going in, that when these governments make promises, you can watch this episode and see whether they have the fiscal space to do it. And if they don't have the space, what this will mean for you in the next few years. On that note, thank you so much for watching.